In this episode, we're going to take a concept that can sound intimidating and turn it into a practical way of thinking that makes defenders faster and more confident. When people first hear the phrase track adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, it can feel like something only large intelligence teams do, far away from day-to-day security work. The truth is that tracking these patterns is one of the best ways to stop feeling surprised, because it shifts your mindset from reacting to alerts to anticipating behavior. Instead of treating every intrusion as a unique emergency, you start recognizing familiar moves that tend to happen in familiar sequences. That recognition helps you decide what to look for next, what to protect first, and where an adversary is likely to apply pressure when you block them. By the end, you should be able to explain what tracking TTPs really means and how it translates into better defensive decisions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, are a way of describing how adversaries operate, but each part of the phrase contributes something different. Tactics describe the high-level goal of a phase of activity, such as gaining initial access, persisting, moving laterally, or collecting data. Techniques describe how that goal is achieved in a general sense, such as using phishing, abusing valid accounts, or creating persistence through scheduled execution. Procedures are the specific ways those techniques are carried out in a particular environment, such as the exact sequence of actions, timing patterns, and choices that reflect an operator's habits. Beginners often treat TTPs as a list of scary tricks, but the real power is that they describe patterns of behavior, not just tools or malware. When you track those patterns, you are essentially building an understanding of an adversary's playbook. A playbook is valuable because it lets you predict what comes next, and prediction is where defense gains leverage. It helps to understand why tracking TTPs is different from collecting indicators, because beginners often mix those ideas together. Indicators like file hashes, domain names, and specific addresses can be useful for quick blocking and quick triage, but they can change fast, and attackers often expect them to be burned. TTPs tend to be more stable because they describe behavior and operational choices, which are harder to change without changing how the adversary works. An adversary can register a new domain quickly, but changing their preferred method for credential theft or their internal movement habits can require retraining, rebuilding, and higher risk. When you focus on TTPs, you are focusing on the aspects of intrusion behavior that persist across changes in superficial artifacts. This does not mean you ignore indicators, because indicators still matter for immediate response, but it does mean you treat them as short-lived clues rather than the foundation of long-term anticipation. A key benefit of tracking TTPs is that it forces you to think in terms of sequences rather than isolated events, and sequences are where anticipation becomes practical. Most intrusions are not a single action, because attackers chain steps together so that one step enables the next. If you recognize a technique associated with initial access, you can ask what techniques typically follow in the next phase for that kind of operator. If you see a sign of persistence, you can ask what procedures the adversary tends to use to maintain control, test access, and expand reach. If you see discovery behavior, you can ask what targets they are likely to probe next, and what data they usually seek before moving. This is where models like the Cyber Kill Chain, CKC, become useful, because they give you a progression lens that makes sequences easier to reason about. Tracking TTPs inside that progression helps you shift from describing what you saw to anticipating what you will likely see soon. Tracking TTPs also becomes clearer when you connect it to the diamond model of intrusion analysis, DMIA, because the diamond helps you understand what is being repeated and what is being changed. The capability vertex often maps to techniques, while the procedures show up in the specific behaviors and patterns of how that capability is used. The infrastructure vertex often changes quickly, but the way infrastructure is used can still show procedure-level consistency, like how often it rotates or how it schedules connections. The victim vertex highlights targeting patterns, which can reveal tactical intent, such as focusing on identity systems, financial workflows, or certain staff roles. The adversary vertex is where repeated habits and constraints show up, like working windows, preferred pathways, and tolerance for noise. When you track TTPs with the diamond in mind, you are less likely to be fooled by superficial change because you are watching for deeper pattern continuity. That continuity is what supports anticipation, since it implies the adversary will likely behave tomorrow as they behaved yesterday. A very practical way to begin tracking is to decide what you are tracking at each level, because the word track can mean anything from casual notes to formal analysis. At the tactic level, you can track what goals you have evidence for, such as credential access, internal discovery, or data collection. At the technique level, you can track the method being used, such as abuse of valid accounts, remote execution, or persistence via scheduled mechanisms. At the procedure level, you track the specific signals that show how the adversary performed the technique in your environment, such as timing, sequence, and the types of systems they touched. This layered view prevents a common beginner mistake, which is to jump straight to naming a technique without considering whether the evidence supports it. It also prevents another mistake, which is to describe procedures without connecting them to higher-level intent, making the analysis feel like trivia. When you tie tactics, techniques, and procedures together, you produce a picture that supports both detection design and decision-making. One reason TTP tracking can feel difficult at first is that beginners worry they need a perfect label for every behavior. But the real goal is consistency and usefulness, not perfect taxonomy. A label is helpful when it helps defenders recognize the same behavior again and respond more quickly, but it becomes harmful when it creates false certainty. If you are unsure whether a behavior is truly credential theft or simply unusual authentication due to normal operations, you can track it as suspicious authentication behavior and collect more evidence. Over time, as you confirm patterns, you can refine the label and increase confidence. This is similar to pressure testing conclusions, because you want your tracking to reflect what is known and what is still forming. The most important habit is to avoid forcing every observation into a named box too early. Tracking is an evolving record of your best understanding, and it should become more precise as evidence accumulates. Another core idea is that TTP tracking is only valuable when it is tied to what defenders can observe, because anticipation depends on visibility. A technique that you cannot observe directly might still be important, but if you have no telemetry that reveals it, you cannot reliably detect it or measure whether it is happening. That means tracking TTPs naturally exposes visibility gaps, which is valuable because it tells you where you are blind and where an adversary could operate without being seen. If you repeatedly struggle to confirm whether persistence was established, that suggests you need better coverage of persistence-related behaviors. If you cannot reliably see internal discovery behavior, that suggests you may be missing key system or network telemetry that reveals scanning and enumeration. This is one reason TTP tracking is not only about responding to incidents, but about improving the environment. By tracking what you can and cannot see, you create a roadmap for strengthening monitoring in the places that matter most. A well-developed TTP tracking habit also helps you anticipate how adversaries adapt when defenders apply pressure, because adaptation is often pattern-based. When an adversary loses a piece of infrastructure, they may shift to a fallback method that they have used before, which shows up as a change in infrastructure but not a change in technique. When an adversary loses a credential, they may attempt to regain access through another account, which shifts the victim vertex while keeping the tactic the same. When an adversary encounters segmentation barriers, they may intensify privilege escalation attempts or increase discovery to find alternate routes, which changes the set of techniques you should expect next. If you have been tracking their previous adaptations, you can predict the likely response to your next control action. This matters because it lets defenders prepare, such as increasing monitoring for specific follow-on behaviors right after taking a containment step. The ability to anticipate adaptation is one of the clearest signs that TTP tracking is producing real defensive value. Another powerful use of TTP tracking is turning scattered incident details into durable detection priorities, because not every detection can be built around a specific artifact. When you track that an adversary repeatedly uses a technique like abuse of valid accounts, You can prioritize detections that focus on anomalous authentication patterns and unusual privilege usage. When you track that they repeatedly establish persistence in predictable ways, you can prioritize detections that look for new persistence mechanisms in contexts where they should not appear. When you track that they often perform internal discovery before lateral movement, you can prioritize detections that flag unusual enumeration behavior and unexpected access to directory or system information. The key is that these are behavior-centric detections, which remain useful even when the attacker swaps malware families or changes infrastructure. TTP tracking gives you the justification for those detections because you can show that they align to observed adversary behavior rather than to generic fear. That alignment increases confidence and helps defenders focus on signals that will likely matter again. TTP tracking also supports threat hunting, because hunting is often guided by hypotheses about what an adversary would do if present. If you have tracked that a certain type of adversary tends to establish persistence quickly, a hunt can focus on persistence-related signals across similar systems. If you have tracked that they tend to pivot toward identity systems, a hunt can prioritize monitoring of administrative access paths and unusual authentication flows. If you have tracked their cadence, you can hunt during windows when their activity is likely to cluster, increasing the chance of catching active behavior. This is why tracking is not only a record of the past, but a guide for proactive work. Hunters want to find needles, and TTP tracking tells them which haystacks are most likely to contain them. Over time, the hunts you run also refine the tracking record, because hunts uncover additional procedures and confirm whether assumptions hold. It is also important to recognize that tracking TTPs is not only about external adversaries, because many environments face repeated patterns from a range of threat sources. Some patterns may come from financially motivated groups, some from opportunistic scanning, and some from insiders or compromised partners, and each may have distinct rhythms and preferences. The point is not to build mythology around attackers, but to develop a defensible understanding of repeated behavior that affects your environment. This is where the idea of restraint remains important, because you do not want to overlink unrelated events just because they share a common technique. Instead, you watch for consistent procedure-level signals, such as repeated sequences, consistent targeting, and consistent adaptation choices. When those signals repeat, you can start to anticipate with higher confidence, because you are observing a stable operational pattern. Tracking becomes a way of learning your adversaries through their behavior, not through assumptions about their identity. For tracking to be useful, it must also be communicated in a way that defenders can act on quickly, because anticipation fails if the information never reaches the people doing the work. A good TTP description includes what was observed, why it matters, and what it suggests to look for next, without forcing readers to interpret vague language. It should also distinguish what is confirmed from what is suspected, because defenders need to know whether to treat something as an immediate response trigger or as a watch item. When you communicate tracking clearly, you enable the team to align on the same expectations, which reduces confusion during response. This is especially important when different roles are involved, like analysts, responders, and detection engineers, because each group needs the same core understanding but applied to different tasks. Clear tracking communication also helps leadership understand why certain controls are prioritized, since the actions can be tied back to repeated adversary behavior. In this way, tracking becomes a shared memory that improves coordination. Another subtle benefit of TTP tracking is that it helps you measure whether defensive changes are working, because you can observe whether the adversary's preferred behaviors are being blocked, detected earlier, or forced to change. If you improve identity monitoring and then see fewer successful suspicious logins, that suggests progress against credential abuse tactics. If you harden a common persistence pathway and then see the adversary attempt alternative persistence methods, that suggests you are creating friction even if the attacker is still trying. If you shorten detection time for a repeated technique, your timelines will show reduced dwell time, which is a measurable improvement in outcome. Tracking provides the vocabulary and the structure for that measurement, because it tells you what behaviors you are trying to impact. Without tracking, it can be hard to know whether your improvements are addressing the actual threat behavior or just making you feel safer. With tracking, you can connect defensive investments to observed change. As we wrap up, Tracking adversary TTPs to anticipate moves is about building a behavior-based understanding of how intrusions progress, how adversaries adapt, and where defenders can create leverage. You start by understanding the difference between tactics, techniques, and procedures, and by recognizing that behavior patterns are often more stable than short-lived indicators. You connect tracking to models like CKC and DMIA so you can see both sequence and relationships, and you keep your labels disciplined so you do not overclaim. You tie tracking to what can be observed, which naturally reveals visibility gaps and guides improvements in monitoring. You use the tracking record to prioritize detection, guide hunting, anticipate adaptation, and measure whether defensive changes are reducing risk. When you do this consistently, you stop feeling like each incident is a brand new mystery and start feeling like you are learning an adversary playbook that you can disrupt, which is one of the most empowering shifts a defender can make.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.